It is still dark when they leave Bethany. A small group of men walking the 2 miles up the dusty road that climbs toward Jerusalem. The city is not yet visible over the ridge, but you can smell it. Wood smoke, animal pens, the sour breath of 100,000 pilgrims sleeping shoulder to shoulder for Passover week. The man at the front of the group is hungry. You can imagine him stopping, pulling his cloak tighter against the morning chill, looking off the side of the road at a single fig tree, full of leaves, catching the first gray light. He walks over to it. The other men watch him. They are tired. They are not paying close attention. They assume he is going to pluck some fruit and keep walking. He does not. He looks at the tree. He says something to it. Quiet, almost gentle. The men cannot hear the words. And then he turns and he keeps walking up the road. And they fall in behind him and nobody asks what just happened. The next morning, on the same road, walking back, they see it. The tree is black. The leaves are dry. The branches are bare. The whole thing is dead, root to crown, like it has been standing in a desert for a year. One of the men points, another one stops. Peter, the loud one, the fisherman, says, "Look, the fig tree you cursed is withered." The man at the front of the group does not explain. He looks at the tree. He nods once. And then he keeps walking toward Jerusalem. Hold that image for a minute. A teacher, his men, a dry tree on a road into the holy city. Because we are going to come back to it. And when we do, you are going to understand what most people miss about the last week of Jesus' life. This is not a story about a tree. This is not a story about a miracle gone wrong. This is not a story about a moment of hunger. This is a story about every sign heaven sent before the worst week in human history. For 1 week in the spring of AD 33, heaven would not stop warning Jerusalem. The signs came from prophets 600 years dead. They came from priests who did not know they were prophesying. They came from a Roman governor's wife, from the sun, from the earth, from a curtain in the temple thick as a man's hand. And by the time it was over, every sign had been answered. And the only people who missed them were the ones standing closest to the cross. It is Sunday. The city is already awake. If you have ever stood on the Mount of Olives looking west, you know the view. Jerusalem spreads out across the valley like a stone garment laid over the hills. The temple platform glows white in the morning sun. The walls are gold at the edges. And on every road into the city, lines of pilgrims are moving. Galileans, Syrians, Egyptians, Greeks, all of them coming for the feast. This is the moment Jesus chooses to make a statement nobody can miss. He sends 2 disciples ahead. He tells them they will find a donkey tied up in the next village with a colt beside her. Untie them. Bring them back. If anyone asks, say, "The Lord has need of them." The men do exactly that. They come back leading 2 animals. Now, here is what most people miss. Every gospel writer mentions both animals. Matthew, the tax collector with the obsessive eye for detail, makes a point of telling you Jesus rode both, the donkey and then the colt. Not one, both, in sequence. Why does that matter? Because 500 years before Jesus was born, a prophet named Zechariah wrote a sentence with one impossible detail in it. Zechariah was not a famous prophet. He came after the exile, when the Jews were limping home from Babylon, trying to rebuild a temple out of memory and rubble. He had 8 visions in one night. And in chapter 9 of his book, he wrote this: "Your king is coming to you righteous and having salvation, lowly, and riding upon an ass, and upon a colt the foal of an ass, a donkey, and a colt. For 5 centuries, every rabbi who read that verse had a problem. Why would the Messiah need 2 animals? You ride one. The grammar made no sense. Some rabbis argued the verse was poetic, repetition for emphasis. Some argued there must be 2 messiahs. None of them said he will ride one and then the other on the same morning. And then Jesus did exactly that. The crowd does not know they are watching a prophecy unfold. They only know a Galilean teacher is riding into the city, and the hour feels different than every other hour. They throw cloaks on the road. They cut palm branches. They start shouting one word over and over, Hosanna. It is a Hebrew word, Hoshana. It means save now. It is a cry from Psalm 118, a plea. But by Jesus' day, it had hardened into a battle cry. The people shouting it wanted a king who would throw the Romans out. They wanted a sword. Jesus heard the same word and knew he would answer it differently than they expected. He was not coming to save them from Rome. He was coming to save them from something Rome could not touch. But it gets stranger. The next day, Jesus walks into the temple courts, and what he does there is so violent, it almost gets him killed on the spot. He flips tables. He scatters coins across the stone floor. He drives the money changers and the sellers out with a whip of cords he braided himself. The doves fly. The cattle bolt. The priests stand frozen at the edge of the court, and the Roman soldiers up on the Antonia fortress put their hands on their sword hilts and wait to see if this becomes a riot. And in the middle of it, Jesus shouts a sentence. My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers. Pay attention to this, because what Jesus just shouted was not original. 600 years before, another man stood in another temple in the same city and shouted the exact same words. His name was Jeremiah. He was a young priest from a village 3 miles north of Jerusalem. He stood in the courtyard of the first temple, the one Solomon built, and he warned the priests that judgment was coming. He quoted God. Is this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? The priests of Jeremiah's day mocked him. 5 years later, the Babylonians burned the temple to the ground. Now think about who was standing in front of Jesus that afternoon. The chief priests, the scribes, the Sadducees, men who had spent their entire lives memorizing the Hebrew scriptures, men who could quote Jeremiah in their sleep. They heard Jesus throw Jeremiah's exact phrase across the temple courtyard, and they did not recognize the quote. They heard the words. They missed the sign. They heard a Galilean troublemaker and not the voice that had spoken 600 years before through a young priest from Anathoth, saying the same thing in the same building, the last destruction. 40 years later, in AD 70, Roman soldiers would burn the second temple down too. A few days later, something quiet happens. Quiet enough that most people skip past it when they read the Gospels. But it is the moment everything turns. A small group of Greeks shows up at the feast. We do not know their names. We do not know where they came from. John just calls them Greeks, Hellenes in the original, Gentile God-fearers who had traveled all the way to Jerusalem because they had heard something about this Jewish teacher and they wanted to see him for themselves. They go to Philip. Philip was from Bethsaida, a fishing town on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, where some of the population spoke Greek. They ask him a simple question. Sir, we would see Jesus. Philip is not sure what to do. He goes to Andrew. The two of them go to Jesus together. Now watch what happens next. For 3 years, every time someone tried to push Jesus into the spotlight, he said the same sentence. My hour is not yet come. He said it to his mother at the wedding in Cana. He said it to his brothers when they tried to march him into Jerusalem. He said it again and again and again. The Greek word is hora, hour. But in John's gospel, it is technical. It means one specific hour, the hour of the cross. For 3 years, the answer was always, not yet, until the Greeks arrived. And Jesus turned to Philip and to Andrew, and he said, the hour is come. The Gentiles had found him. That was the sign he was waiting for. The whole world was reaching toward Jerusalem now. Not just the Jews, but the nations, and that meant the moment had arrived. The cross was no longer somewhere out in the future. It was this week. Stop for a second. Look at what we already have. A prophet, 500 years dead, who wrote a sentence about 2 animals that nobody understood until a Sunday morning in spring. A temple full of experts who heard their own scripture quoted in their own courtyard and could not place it. A handful of Greeks from somewhere across the Mediterranean who walked up to one fisherman with one question and flipped a switch in heaven that had been waiting 3 years to flip. 3 signs, 3 answered prophecies, and we are not even at the table yet. If you are still with me, do me one favor. Hit subscribe, because what comes next is the part nobody tells you. The signs are about to get stranger and quieter and closer to home. Here is the part nobody tells you. The Sanhedrin meets in secret. Picture the room, a long stone hall lit by oil lamps. 70 men in long robes sitting in a half circle. Pharisees on one side, Sadducees on the other. And at the front, on a raised seat, the high priest. His name is Joseph, son of Caiaphas. He has held the office for almost 20 years, longer than any high priest of the Roman era. Most of the men in that room owe their position to him. When he speaks, the council listens. He is angry. The reports keep coming in. Jesus raised a man named Lazarus from the dead in Bethany. The crowds are growing. The Romans are watching. If this gets out of hand, Pilate will send the legions, and Pilate is not a careful man. Caiaphas stands up, and he says one sentence that John, the disciple, will write down decades later in his gospel. You know nothing at all. You do not understand that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation should not perish. The council nods. They hear it as politics. One troublemaker dies. The nation survives. Rome stays calm. The temple stays open. A practical solution. Pay attention to this, because John pauses the narrative right there, and he adds a sentence that should make the hair on your arm stand up. He says, Caiaphas did not speak this of himself. Being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. Stop and feel the weight of that. The most powerful religious man in Israel, sitting in his own council chamber, plotting a political murder, opened his mouth and accidentally preached the gospel. One man would die for the people, so that the nation would not perish. Caiaphas thought he was talking about Roman politics. He was actually quoting the future. He was actually quoting Isaiah 53, which had been written 700 years earlier, about a suffering servant who would be wounded for the transgressions of the people. The high priest of Israel had become a prophet, and he had no idea. Thursday night, an upper room, 13 men reclining around a low table. You have seen the paintings? Forget them. The reality was smaller. A low U-shaped table, cushions on the floor, lamplight, the smell of roasted lamb and bitter herbs and unleavened bread. Outside, Jerusalem is full of families doing the same meal, the Passover Seder, the way their families have done it for 1,400 years. But this Passover is different. because at one of those tables, the host says something that lands in the room like a dropped knife. One of you will betray me. The disciples freeze. They start asking, one after another, "Is it I, Lord?" They're good men, confused men. None of them, including the one who already has 30 pieces of silver in a bag, can quite believe what they are hearing. Then, Jesus does something specific. He quotes a psalm. Stay with me here, because this is the moment. 1,000 years before that night, King David wrote Psalm 41. David was sick. David was surrounded by enemies. And David wrote one line that has haunted the Hebrew scriptures ever since. He that eats my bread has lifted up his heel against me. In Hebrew, lifting the heel was an idiom. It meant the betrayal of someone you trusted with your food. In the ancient world, eating with someone was a covenant. Bread was sacred. To break bread with a man and then turn on him was the worst kind of treachery. Worse than the betrayal of an enemy, because an enemy you expect. Jesus quotes the psalm at the table, and then he picks up a piece of bread, and he dips it, and he hands it to Judas Iscariot, the disciple from Kerioth, the one who carried the money bag, the one who had already gone to Caiaphas and negotiated a price. 30 pieces of silver, which is the same amount listed in the book of Exodus as the price of a slave gored to death by an ox. The treasurer of the 12 disciples valued at the price of an accidental death. Judas takes the bread, he eats it, he stands up, and he walks out of the room into the dark. The disciples do not understand what they just saw. John writes later that they thought Judas was going to buy more supplies for the feast. Heaven understood. It is Friday morning, just after sunrise. In the governor's palace, Pontius Pilate is being woken up early. There is a crowd at the gate. The chief priests have brought a Galilean teacher in chains, and they are demanding a death sentence. Pilate, who hates the priests and has been on bad terms with them for years, sits down on the judgment seat in the stone court outside the palace. And this is where it gets remarkable. A servant comes through the side door with an urgent message from his wife. We do not know her name in the Bible. The text just calls her Pilate's wife. But the Eastern Orthodox Church remembers her by name, Claudia Procula, and they honor her as a saint with a feast day in October. Tradition holds she was a granddaughter of the Emperor Augustus. The message is short. Have nothing to do with that righteous man. I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. Stop and notice what just happened. Of all the people swarming around Jesus on the morning of the cross, the chief priests, the scribes, the elders, the Roman soldiers, the Jewish crowd, the only person who received a direct warning from God was a Gentile woman who had probably never met Jesus. The high priest of Israel did not get a dream. A Roman pagan housewife did. She woke up afraid. She wrote the note. She sent the servant. And Pilate, who knew his wife, who had been married to her for years, who knew she was not a hysterical woman, read the message and went pale. He turned to the crowd, and he tried 3 different times to let Jesus go. Heaven had warned the wrong house, and the right house had not been listening. Friday afternoon, the sun is high over Jerusalem. The temple courts are loud, louder than they have ever been. There's one more thing you need to see. Inside the temple, the priests are preparing for the Passover sacrifice. The 1st century Jewish historian Josephus, writing a generation later, estimated that in a single Passover, the priests of Jerusalem slaughtered more than 250,000 lambs. 250,000. In one afternoon, the blood ran in channels cut into the stone floor. The smoke from the burning fat darkened the sky above the temple roof. The Mishnah, the rabbinic record of temple practice, specifies the exact hour the lambs were to die, between the 9th and 11th hour. By Roman reckoning, that is between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. Now look at the cross. Outside the city wall, on a low hill the Romans used for executions, a Galilean teacher is dying. He has been hanging since the 3rd hour, 9 in the morning. The sky has gone dark at noon, which we will get to in a minute. And at the 9th hour, the exact moment the first lamb's throat is being cut in the temple courtyard, the man on the cross lifts his head and shouts one word. The Greek is tetelestai. It is one word. In English we say, it is finished. But the Greek is something different. Tetelestai was a merchant's word. It was stamped on a receipt when a debt was paid in full. It was a soldier's word, shouted at the end of a mission. It was the word a servant said to a master when the task was complete. The priest in the temple cut the lamb's throat. The man on the cross said the word. The two events happened at the same hour, on the same Friday, in the same city, by the same God. And the priests in the temple, doing the sacrifice they had done every spring for 1,400 years, did not know they were performing the funeral of their own sacrificial system. Go back 3 hours, to noon. 750 years before that Friday, a man named Amos was tending sheep on the hills outside a small village called Tekoa, 12 miles south of Jerusalem. He was not a priest. He was not a prophet's son. He was a herdsman who also dressed sycamore figs for a living. A working man, calloused hands, sunburned neck. God sent him north to the kingdom of Israel to deliver a message of judgment. Most of his book is what you would expect. Warnings about injustice. Warnings about the rich crushing the poor. But in the 8th chapter, Amos writes a single line that does not fit the rest of his book. A line so strange that for 7.5 centuries, no Jewish commentator was sure what to do with it. I will cause the sun to go down at noon, says the Lord, and I will darken the earth in the clear day. For 7.5 centuries, that verse sat in the scrolls like a sealed letter. And then, at the 6th hour on a Friday, in the spring of AD 33, the sun over Jerusalem went out. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, for 3 hours, the sky over Judea went dark. Matthew records it, Mark records it, Luke records it. A pagan Greek historian named Phlegon of Tralles also recorded it in a separate work that the church historian Eusebius later quoted. A great darkness, an earthquake, in the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad. A shepherd from Tekoa, 750 years earlier, had written the headline, and then, at the 9th hour, when the man on the cross said, "Tetelestai," the ground shook. The veil in the temple, a curtain woven of blue and purple and scarlet, thick as the palm of a man's hand, 60 feet tall, separating the holy place from the most holy place. The veil tore from the top to the bottom. A priest standing in the inner court that afternoon would have heard the sound. Cloth tearing under its own weight, the seam unzipping itself from the ceiling down. He would have stared. The most sacred room in his world, the room only one man entered once a year, was suddenly visible, open, empty, and now I need you to go all the way back to where we started, to a road outside Bethany, to a small group of men walking up to Jerusalem in the gray light, to a fig tree full of leaves with no fruit. In the Hebrew prophets, the fig tree was always a picture of Israel, a nation full of religious leaves with no fruit underneath. Jesus did not curse that tree because he was hungry. He cursed it because it was a sign. The tree was the nation. The leaves were the temple. The missing fruit was the missing Messiah they refused to see. The week the temple veil tore, the tree had already withered. The sign was given on Monday. The meaning was revealed on Friday. And the priests standing in their torn sanctuary never made the connection. Now think of a parent who watched a child make a decision the parent knew would end in disaster, who warned, who pleaded, who sent every signal love can send, who finally fell silent on the porch as the door closed and the car drove away. You know that ache. You have either been that parent or you have been that child. That is heaven that week. A father who had been warning his children for 1,000 years, through prophets, through priests, through a Roman housewife, through the sun and the earth and the curtain in his own house. And the children walked past every sign. This is not the story of a man who died because politics turned against him. This is not the story of a prophet who picked the wrong week to come to Jerusalem. This is not the story of a tragic accident. This is the story of a death heaven had been announcing for 1,000 years. So where does this leave you and me, 2,000 years later, watching from the other side of the cross? 3 things to take with you. 1, every sign before the cross had a precedent. The donkey had Zechariah. The temple cleansing had Jeremiah. The dipped bread had Psalm 41. The 3 hours of darkness had Amos. The dying lamb had Exodus. Heaven did not improvise that week. The death of Jesus was the most foreshadowed event in human history. If you ever wonder whether your life is being held by a God who plans, look at that week. 9 signs in 7 days, answering prophets who had been dead for centuries. He plans. 2, the people who missed the signs were not the foreigners. They were not the pagans. They were not the outsiders. The people who missed every sign were the experts. The men who could quote the scriptures in their sleep, who lived in the shadow of the temple, who wore the robes and held the offices. They walked past every warning. Meanwhile, a Roman housewife and a thief on a cross saw what the high priest could not. Distance from God is not measured in miles. It is measured in pride. The closest people to the temple were the farthest from the meaning. 3, and this is the one I want you to sit with. Heaven still warns. The signs are quieter now. They do not always tear curtains or darken suns. Sometimes they come as a sermon you almost skipped, as a verse that will not leave your head, as a friend who keeps bringing up the same conversation, as a Tuesday morning when something in you whispers, you cannot keep going like this. You know the warnings? The question is not whether God is speaking. The question is whether you are going to be the priest who missed it or the Roman woman who woke up afraid. Which of these 9 signs hit you the hardest? The donkey, the dream, the darkness, the dipped bread? Tell me below. I read every comment on this channel. And if this is the first video of mine you have watched, subscribe. Because we are going to keep walking through scripture this way, one quiet sign at a time. He warned them for 1,000 years. He is still warning. Listen.